Hello, welcome to VQA Chardonnay 2.0. I am Magdalena Kaiser and the Director of Public Relations at VQA Wines of Ontario, and also here to help with the delivery of education and knowledge. So welcome to the second Chardonnay session that we have for you, specially produced for the LCBO staff. So hopefully you've seen Chardonnay 1.0, and if you haven't, that's okay, because we have lots of similar content, but this 2.0 version has a little bit additional information on our sub-appellations, and we also have a different moderator. We also have different producers and different wines. So be sure to watch all 10 webinars if you can. So it's going to be another exciting day of Chardonnay. With these sessions, we've designed them to have you discover key flavor characteristics of these varieties and also learn about the different styles, and of course, to meet the makers. So now let me introduce you to our host for today. Next slide, great. So John Sabo, Master Sommelier and Principal Critic at Wine Align, is with us today to take us through the Chardonnay 2.0. He will also be interviewing 6 different producers from Ontario to share their stories, but also talk about the wines that they have in the LCBO. So without further ado, John, happy to get you started for another exciting day.
Thank you, Magdalena. Welcome, everyone. Terrific to be here. We're going to jump right into this. I'd like to get onto the winemakers as soon as possible because they are the ones with the stories to tell. So in just a few minutes, I'll introduce Brian Hamilton from Kin Vineyards, Keith Tyers from CLOSSON Chase Vineyards, Louise Engel from Featherstone Estate, Ed Madronich from Flat Rock Cellars, Matt Loney from Stoney Ridge Estate, and Harold Teal from Hidden Bench Estate. With one wine from each of them, we're going to apply them for their story, their background, their details about their specific little plot of land, what makes them special, what makes them unique. But first, let's take some minutes here just to give you a little bit of background detail. You will have seen some in session 1. Thanks to Peter Rod, I'm going to try and give you a little bit more background detailed information on what makes Ontario special, what makes it unique. It is a story of lakes, latitude, and limestone. Essentially, if you can remember those 3 things, you're well on your way to understanding Ontario wine. And of course, we'll get into the wine styles. I have to say I'm particularly excited about this session, Chardonnay, because I firmly believe that it is one of Canada's best varieties and certainly one of Ontario's most distinctive varieties. And I'm sure some of you had the opportunity to attend the I4C, the International Cool Climate Chardonnay celebration that happens yearly. In fact, even happened this year, 2020, down in Niagara, although in a virtual session where we've celebrated the cool climate Chardonnay that is made in Ontario and Canada and the rest of the world, kind of bringing the world of Chardonnay, cool climate Chardonnay producers together. It is an important variety for our production, and it is, I'm going to try and make the case, as will the winemakers, a distinctive variety. Now, I've been following Canadian wine and Ontario wine pretty much my whole career. I started getting into wine in the late 80s. Most of the winemakers here are pretty young, might not remember those days, but those were very different times. And I can tell you, having followed and grown up alongside the industry, it has improved leaps and bounds. I mean, the quality has really risen to international heights. I can say that quite firmly. I've been a judge at the National Wine Awards in the early days with Wine Access, and since with Wine Align, pretty much since its inception. So I've had the opportunity to taste broadly across Canada and Ontario and see that rise in quality. And the varieties that we're going to focus on for these sessions, I can tell you, are the varieties that we all as judges get excited about when it comes time for those categories to come across our tables at the National Wine Awards. So lots of positives to describe here, but let me get right on with some of the background details. I know you know where we are in Ontario, between about 44 and 41 degrees latitude. You can see where that puts us internationally on the map, with some notable differences. Toronto's on about the same latitude as Florence, Tuscany, and Northern California. Obviously, we don't have the same climate as those places. Our story is about that latitude, yes, right in that sweet spot worldwide where you get around the right amount of sunlight hours and growing degree days and length of growing season to reliably ripen grapes. But we have a much cooler climate overall than those areas I just mentioned. It is a cool continental climate. We have 4 distinct seasons. And really, if it weren't for those big bodies of water that you see next to all Ontario vineyards, well, then we wouldn't have the same story to tell. So it really is about the latitude, about the lakes, and we'll talk soil in a minute. But first of all, referencing the lakes here, this is a nice little cross section of the Great Lakes system. You can see Lake Superior is the deepest, but I want to point out Lake Ontario, which is the second deepest lake there, 224 meters. Why is that important? Well, it becomes a massive energy sink, which does not freeze over in the wintertime. Obviously, we get well below zero in the wintertime, where most shallow bodies of water would freeze over solid, which would mean real problems for winter kill. But the fact that Lake Ontario remains, for the most part, open water all year round means that you have a moderating effect that protects the onshore areas and stops climate from, or temperature from, dropping much below -15, -20. Sometimes we get a little bit cooler than that, at which point grapevines can suffer. But for the most part, we're protected. And in the summertime, of course, we get the flip result. In the spring, the onshore areas are cooled because you're right next to a cold body of water. In the fall, you're now next to a warm body of water, so it mitigates the length of the growing season and the last frost and first frost, and gives Chardonnay producers, in any case, about the classic 100 days or so from flowering to harvest, which is what is critical when we're talking about cool climate. The length of that growing season, and the fact that we can accumulate sugars slowly and retain acidities to create the style of Chardonnay and the other varieties that we will discuss in future episodes. Lake Erie, I'll also point out, there's quite a lot shallower, and we'll see in a moment why that is a different type of climate. And then soils, there's lots of talk in the world of wine about soils. In Ontario, it's a story of limestone, old sedimentation from whence this was a tropical sea area. So sea creatures that have accreted over time, sedimented into pretty hard but friable rock called limestone. And without getting into the chemistry of limestone, I can say, and we'll hear from the winemakers in just a moment, it's about the structure of the soil. It's about making it a little bit more open, more aerated, mitigating the density of clays and silts, which are the other things that you find in Ontario vineyards, other types of soil. So these little chunks of limestone really give a lighter, more friable soil, which vines happen to love. And then there are, of course, some chemical signatures, but let's not get too far into that because the science remains a little controversial. But, you know, it's enough to say limestone. Most people associate limestone and high quality wine around the world. A little note about glacial erosion, because that was an important part of the geological story in Ontario. You can see 14,000 years ago, most of where we are now was under a very thick ice sheet, almost 2 kilometers thick, the Laurentide ice sheet, which slowly receded over several thousand years. And as glaciers recede, they grind and deposit. So you have that limestone base, which was then eroded, ground down into, in some cases, a fine limestone powder, which you see sprinkled in the vineyards, or in other parts of Ontario, left it a little bit more intact, like in Prince Edward County, where it just kind of scraped off the top, leaving very little topsoil on top of a limestone shelf. And you can see the Great Lakes present day. So there you have latitude, perfect latitude, 41, 44 degrees. We have the lakes, which provide critical moderating effect for grape growers. And we have what many consider the finest soil in the world for wine growing, limestone. Right. Okay, let's get into an explanation of the appellation. If you've studied wine, which all of you have, you're familiar with the pyramid, as most regions describe their levels of appellation. So here in Ontario, we have at the base level, VQA Ontario. So this can come from anywhere, any of the 3 official wine growing regions, or one of the emerging regions all qualify for VQA Ontario. Above that, a little bit more specific, one of the appellations, Niagara Peninsula, Lake Erie North Shore, Prince Edward County. And then above that, smaller areas still, more discrete, pieces of land are the sub-appellations, and more on that in a moment. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, if you will, we will have single vineyards, not technically controlled yet by VQA, but these are, for the most part, winemakers who believe they found a really special piece of land, enough so to put the name of that vineyard on the label. So pretty standard stuff, familiar to all. I will just point out that have to be very clear when we're talking to readers, consumers, whoever it may be. VQA, what does that mean? 100% Ontario grown. There is still confusion out there. I know I get letters from readers all the time about the difference between international domestic blends and VQA. And for me, it's the story that we need to tell. VQA is, of course, 100% grown here and then controlled like any other appellation varieties that can be planted, winemaking techniques, minimum degrees of ripeness at harvest, et cetera, et cetera. So VQA functions like any other appellation authority around the world, guarantees, I hesitate to say quality, that's more slippery to define, but certainly guarantees provenance and to some degree the style you can expect to find. But of course, you all know that. All right, let's get on to the main appellations, primary appellations. Niagara Peninsula. As you know, this is where the majority of production occurs. Depending on where you find your stats, something like 87% of all plantings in Ontario are in the Niagara Peninsula. Lake Erie North Shore would be the next most important in terms of acreage planted, about 8% or so. And then the newest viticultural area, Prince Edward County from 2007, designated, representing about 4% of acreage planted. And then we have the emerging regions, statistics to come on those, but just so you're aware, there are lots of other parts of the province where grapes are grown and wine is made, like over on Lake Huron here, up by Georgian Bay in the Collingwood area, down on the south shores of Ontario around Lake Erie and the lovely summer resort town of Port Dover. Yes, there are some wineries in the Toronto area, up around Stouffville, and as you'll taste in just a moment, over here in the Ottawa Valley. So those are areas to look forward to. They'll all appear as VQA Ontario for now until they become official, if they become official viticultural areas. So the story continues to grow. All right, let's get briefly into the sub-appellations of the Niagara Peninsula. And just to highlight a couple of the differences here, and again, the winemakers will tell us more about that. But as I mentioned off the top, it's pretty much a story of lake and, in the case of the Niagara Peninsula, the Niagara Escarpment itself, which runs right along here and over past Niagara River, where of course we have Niagara Falls. It's where the Niagara River runs over the Niagara Escarpment. So the two main topographic features really, to a large extent, drive the minute differences, but differences enough to create various wine styles within one single region. So you don't want to be too close to the lake because you're really exposed to the full brunt of the lake effect. Too far away from the lake, you don't get enough of that. So most of the action happens in that sweet spot where you're between about 1-2 kilometers from the lake to about 10 kilometers is the longest stretch from Niagara on the lake here, the shores up to St. David's. Some things I've noticed over the years, this area around, which we call the escarpment area, a little bit cooler than this area over here, a little bit flatter topography, slightly warmer. Here's where you find many of the top Cab Merlot blends, some terrific Syrah Shiraz down in St. David's, or more robust Pinots or more robust Chardonnays, compared to areas around here, around Grimsby down by the lake, where it's terrific Riesling country, Cabernet Franc country, Chardonnay of a lighter, fresher, crisper styles. And then beyond that, we can go into all kinds of nuanced details, just enough to say that there are differences, and these sub-appellations were created by Dr. Tony Shaw at Covey, who mapped all sorts of data, topographic, soil types, minimum, maximum temperatures, growing degree days, all the sort of parameters that are important for wine growing, digitalized those, put them on the map, and then superimposed the map, and then drew these sub-appellations around the areas that had distinct characteristics. You'll be able to download this presentation later. You can see some of the details that have been outlined on this slide between the different sub-appellations, but I'll leave that for you to do on your own. Quick look at those two kind of main sub-regional areas, the Niagara Escarpment, which is part of UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve, by the way, actually, a reserve that runs all the way along the escarpment, some 725 kilometers or so, and contains the greatest diversity of species in all of the Canadian biosphere reserves. Maybe that's an interesting little tidbit to share with some of your consumers. Wines are grown literally in a biosphere reserve, which is why vineyard acreage will be limited in the future. You just can't plant a vineyard anywhere in a biosphere reserve. So in this regional appellation, we have the three bench, so-called bench appellations, Short Hills, 20 Mile, and Beamsville. And I'll just point out a couple of little details here, like growing degree days, 1583, and frost-free days, 205 days on average above -2 degrees. And just to compare that with this area down on Niagara on the Lake, you can see growing degree is a little bit warmer. Again, small differences, but small differences make the difference. Slightly longer season here, 207 instead of 205 frost-free days. But remember, the vine is a very sensitive instrument, and minute differences in average temperatures, length of growing season make for quite dramatically different wine styles. And then over to Prince Edward County, you can see we've dropped growing degree days considerably. It is the coolest viticultural area in Ontario, save perhaps some of the emerging regions, with a slightly shorter growing season. Here you would struggle, say, to ripen Cabernet Sauvignon, certainly Syrah, but it makes quite brilliant, lightning, sharp Chardonnay, light, delicate Pinot, very fragrant, along with a few other varieties. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, and down to Lake Erie North Shore. Here, believe it or not, is the sunniest place in Ontario, and I've actually read sunniest in Canada, I guess up there with the southern Okanagan, with quite a long growing season. Now here I mentioned the importance of the lake. We are right next to Lake Erie, which is much shallower and much warmer, which is to say, well, warmer and cooler. It modulates temperature much more rapidly than Lake Ontario, which is much deeper. So here you do get some frozen sections of the lake during really cold winters, which means that winters can be really quite tough here. So you've got one of the warmest, sunniest areas, but at the same time, one of the coolest in the winter, with less of a limestone story, a little bit more sand, which for me produces wines of quite a lot of finesse and fragrance and elegance, perhaps a little bit less tannic structure. Let's talk specifically about Chardonnay. It is one of the most important varieties, single variety wines produced in Ontario. No surprise there. Somewhere around, we don't need to get into the stats, but around 13% of total wine production. So right up there with Riesling, Pinot Gris also emerging alongside that, or should I say Grigio. But really, for my money, as I said, Chardonnay and Riesling are the two flagship varieties, if we were to have flagship varieties. All right, a little bit about how Ontario wine is viewed in the world. These are all former speakers at the I4C, the Cool Climate Chardonnay celebration. And over the decade or so that the celebration has been in existence, we've seen the reputation of Ontario wines in general, but Chardonnay in particular, really come a very long way. You can see some of the comments here by well-respected, well-known figures in the world of wine, like Andrew Jefford. He made a great comment at this previous I4C this past summer in his virtual presentation about the enduring loveliness. I just love that term. The enduring loveliness of Ontario wine and Ontario Chardonnay in particular, because after all, wine has to be not just distinctive, it has to be pleasant to drink. And we can agree that Ontario Chardonnay is by and large extremely drinkable stuff. Karen McNeil, Ian D'Agata, some very prominent figures. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I've held master classes for incoming sommeliers from the UK and from the US for about 10 years or so. And it's terrific to see the smiles on the faces of these prominent sommeliers and buyers in the top restaurants of London and New York and San Francisco, how they have taken to understand the position of Ontario wines, and in this case, in Chardonnay in particular, And if I could give you just my perspective that has been distilled from conversations with countless top tasters from around the world, many people put the style into the mid-Atlantic. Now, hear me out on this one. We don't compare ourselves to Burgundy. It's not Burgundy. Yet at the same time, we're not Oregon. We're not even far out Sonoma Coast, for example. On the West Coast, those wines are a little bit richer, a little bit fatter, a little bit more tropical. Over in Burgundy, they're angular and sharp, sometimes downright lean, whereas Ontario kind of fits in that beautiful mid-Atlantic, a little bit closer to the old world, a little bit closer to the European model, yet with a little more generosity, a little more fruit. And I think we'll see that as we taste through these examples that we have with us today. So in terms of wine styles in Ontario, a number of different styles, it's a very versatile grape, are possible. Of course, there's some unoaked. We're going to taste a couple of examples of those. These are more in the crisp, fresh, lively, slightly more aromatic side of things. And then the other great division over on the other side, fermented and aged, very often in barrel. Then, of course, we could get into a whole other discussion about age of wood, size of wood, origin of wood, all of these nuances that ultimately affect the final style of the wine, which we all know. But let's not forget other important styles of VQA Chardonnay, sparkling wine, one of my favorites, especially Blanc de Blanc, certainly one of my favorite traditional method sparkling wine styles, full stop, in the world. You know, there are some blended versions with Pinot Noir and Meunier, but pure Chardonnay from Ontario is really quite brilliant. There is also an emerging category of skin fermented white orange wines, if you will, amber wine sometimes, particularly with Chardonnay Musqué, a clone of Chardonnay. I know Vineland makes a terrific one. Trail Estates here in Prince Edward County, also Trainer Vineyards. So not a big category, but these are wines, white wines made like red wines, so fermented on the skins. And of course, in Ontario, ice wine is a major product. And yes, some rare, not too frequent, but some rare Chardonnay ice wines are also made. So there you have it. Chardonnay really covers a broad range of styles, from crisp and unoaked through sparkling right down to sweet and delicious ice wine. When it comes to pairing food and wine, what I love about VQA Chardonnay, and in fact Ontario wines in general, is their cool climate nature, which is to say vibrant acids, a little bit lower alcohol, all of which make them very versatile at the table. So use your imagination here. There are so many different options, of course, with Ontario wines in general, but say unoaked VQA Chardonnay, here we're all about this stuff from the sea, crudo, oysters, fish, shellfish, higher acid cheeses like goat's cheese, for example. Tangy cheeses work really well with unoaked styles of Chardonnay. When you move into the barrel fermented category, these become a little bit more bold and rich. Of course, you get the range of aromas out of the barrel itself. But for me, also an important change with this style is the textural development. Very often, these are full malolactic fermentation, very often some lees stirring, which increases the body, releases all of those manoproteins from the yeast cells and results in wines that are more rich, more creamy, more textured. And here you can move into, say, white meats. Obviously, roast chicken goes well across the board, but particularly well here, or into roast pork, for example, or harder cheeses, even smoked cheeses, picking up on the nuances of the barrel influence itself. And then when you get over into the Blanc de Blanc, traditional method sparkling category, here, again, there's almost nothing these wines don't work well with. It's a little sommelier's secret that whenever you're not sure what to pair, pull out a traditional method sparkling wine. It invariably goes well. You can up the luxury factor here, bringing in lobster or seafood, these sorts of things. Or you could take it downscale and throw out a bowl of hot buttered popcorn with traditional method. Blanc de Blanc is an absolute dream of a match. So very versatile, covering a wide range of foods, given the range of styles on offer. And cheese, well, we should talk about cheese. Ontario makes a great range of artisanal cheeses. And just to reiterate some of the things I've already said, when you're dealing with the unoaked, crisper, lighter style, I would move towards a tangier cheese. In this case, we've got the Bridget's Brie, so a little bit of cream here. The acid tends to cleanse the mouth between bites of the richer, fattier cheese and leaves you refreshed, waiting for the next bite. And then, of course, when you move back over into the barrel fermented oak aged Chardonnays is where we introduce some of the smoked cheeses, the harder cheeses. As you can see here, smoked Gouda, particularly well, mountain oak. These sorts of cheeses, hard, tangy, salty, go well with the fruit and the texture. We'll talk to Harold Teal in just a moment, who's involved in the Upper Canada Cheese Company. He'll give us some of his favorite pairings with his Ontario Chardonnay. All right, so here are the wines that we have selected, or rather that you selected for us to taste with you. So we're going to cover a full range of appellations and lots of different styles. And let's jump right in and bring Brian Hamilton from Kin Vineyards into it. Kin Vineyards, which as you can see there is 5,962 kilometers from Beaune. Not that we're comparing to Burgundy, but that was paced out by Brian personally, as he told me earlier. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about your history. Tell us about the Ottawa Valley and the town of Carp, which is nearest to you, how you ended up here, what makes your little parcel of Ontario vineyard land a little different from, say, Niagara Peninsula or Prince Edward County.
Good morning, everybody. I hope that you can hear me well. I'm on a mobile phone, but thank you for asking for us to participate in the session today. So give you a little information on Kin Vineyards. As was pointed out in the earlier presentation, we are an emerging wine region here in Ontario and not yet recognized as a designated viticultural area. We are located in the town of Carp, which is about 20 minutes west of downtown Ottawa, and currently are the only plantings of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in the Ottawa Valley. It's a challenging environment from the standpoint that we're needing to bury our vines after harvest. We are certainly in a cold zone that the vines do need to be buried for protection. But we also take advantage of some really interesting soils on our 47-acre property here. We are located over what is called the Ottawa Formation and the Hazeldean Fault, which is essentially a gray limestone fault with a lot of glacial till, some silty soils, some clay sections, and certainly a lot of exposed limestone in our middle block. So interesting soil types for these varieties, and also very interesting location in terms of aspect and exposure. We are atop a ridge, an escarpment of sorts here called the Carp Ridge that gives us a wonderful southwest exposure, basically an accumulation of sunshine throughout our shorter growing season. We generally will see bloom in about mid-June. And so our 100 days takes us to about the middle of September. And we are looking at picking windows tentatively now at the end of September, early October for our fruit. We are farming. I think it's important to or to point out rather, that our farming philosophy is one of sustainability, incorporating largely organic and biodynamic methodology wherever possible. And in so doing, we invigorate and maintain a viable soil that grows better fruit and ultimately better wine.
Terrific. So tell me a little bit about the typical tasting room conversation you might have. I imagine people kind of drop in from time to time and are, I'm sure, curious to taste the wine. How do you describe the wine style that you produce, both your philosophy and what your vineyards want to give you?
If we look at it is an interesting conversation to have with people. They're firstly very shocked to see that there's a vineyard in the area, even although we are only one of maybe half a dozen different vineyards and wineries. It's a little unusual, of course, that we're growing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So the conversation usually starts with, wow, you can grow grapevines here. And then we go on to actually describe our location in terms of latitude, which you touched on earlier, John, in your presentation. We are to the degree the same latitude as Chablis. We're at 45.3 degrees north. And perhaps not surprisingly, being over a limestone-based fault, being at that latitude where we have copious amounts of sunshine in Ottawa. So really the varieties are planted well in terms of being able to ripen. Ottawa is a very sunny part of Ontario. But certainly perhaps surprisingly, our wines have a very high acidity, which could be likened to Chablis. We have a very focused fruit profile, leaner, if you will, but certainly maintains freshness, ageability. It's personally a style that I love very much, a far more focused wine, perhaps a little bit fresher and racy, as I have pointed out. But the fruit from our estate essentially goes into our top end brand, which is tagged with the moniker Carp Ridge. Not being a recognized DBA, we can't use the word estate or vineyard, but we certainly can use the moniker Carp Ridge on our top bottlings. And that's where perhaps our Chardonnay fruit is softened somewhat through controlled and judicious mallow, the use and very judicious use of French oak for fermentation and indigenous fermentation, careful batonnage when needed so that we can actually soften that leanness and bring about something that's somewhat more opulent.
Great, and just lastly, tell us a little bit more about Civil Grit in particular. What's the fruit source for this wine?
This is one, this wine is actually sourced from Niagara fruit, Niagara on the lake, to be more specific. And what I like about making unoaked chard, and this particular wine in general, is that we can work with Chardonnay as a neutral variety, but we can really explore Chardonnay's potential to be extremely aromatic. So in making this wine, I want to preserve all the acidity that the fruit gives us, because it is from a slightly warmer appellation in Ontario. And so there is no malolactic done with this wine. It's completely fermented in stainless steel, so without the use of oak of any kind. And we're really only periodically batonnaging the wine to give a little bit of more richness to the palate, a little more softness to the palate, and balance out the acidity. But I really think that we've achieved an exceptionally aromatic Chardonnay. So it shows how aromatic this variety can in fact be when you don't complicate it with oak, you don't complicate it with mallow, and perhaps the use of a controlled yeast over a very somewhat extended cool fermentation time. This wine was done over 5 weeks, when generally many wines done in barrel would be done at 2 to 3 weeks. So cooler fermentation, cultured yeast to express the aromatics. I think you get a wine that's quite surprising that it's Chardonnay, often likened to Chenin Blanc, or maybe even Sauvignon Blanc with that herbaceous edge.
Well, I have to say, well done. Lovely, vibrant, crisp, fresh. I think the world needs more wine styles like this. This, for me, is that perfect versatile wine that you pull out on the patio, bring to the dinner table, have with your first course, or through to the end of the meal, depending on what you're having. So congratulations, well done. And I remember when David Lorison, my colleague, went up to visit you, he brought us a couple of bottles back to the wine line office of your Carp Ridge, which was very impressive. So well done for waving the flag for the Ottawa area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
All right, let's now turn it over to Ed Madronich for another unplugged or unoaked Chardonnay. Ed, do we have you there?
I believe you do. Yes, there we go. Getting all this technology right. We should be experts at it by now. Thanks,
Brilliant.
John.
Yeah, so give us a little bit of the background. I know when you started out, you were focused pretty much exclusively on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Riesling to some degree. I'd love that you focused right from the beginning. Maybe after you tell us a little bit about your background, whether you still think that was the right decision for you and for Ontario in general, or would you expand the list of varieties? But first, tell us a little bit about your background, your history.
Well, I'll even answer that one right off the top, because yes, we do focus on Chard, Pinot, and Riesling. And I think at the time, you know, we planted back in 2000, 2001, and I think we hadn't figured out what we wanted, what we were very good at here in Ontario. And I just looked at our site on the bench, on the 20-mile bench, and felt very strongly doing the research, looking at the soil, looking at the climate numbers, that Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Riesling was what needed to go there. And so very happy with that decision. And I definitely haven't changed my mind. In fact, over the last 20 years, I've been, every year, I more and more reinforce that was the right decision at the time. So absolutely, that is one of the cores to Flat Rock Cellars.
That's great. And just looking at the map here, where you are, you're pretty much right on the border of Vinemount Ridge. So halfway up the escarpment. I've been to your place many times. You driving up, at least a couple of 100 meters versus the lake shore. So how much cooler is it here than, say, a little bit further down or over on Niagara on the lake?
Well, it's a great question, John. And we're actually less moderated. So what's interesting about that is in spring, we're actually warmer. We're probably about 2, often 3 weeks warmer than up closer to the lake in terms of development. And then in fall, it gets cooler faster at our place. And I think that's why the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir work so well with us, is those are earlier ripening varieties. So we're typically finished picking all our grapes on our vineyard by October 15th would be late for us. So it's less about being warmer or colder. It's more about being less moderated and warmer in spring and cooler in fall. That gives us the unique characteristics of Flat Rock Cellars. And as you said, we are on the 20 mile, right on the escarpment. I'll say 3/4 of the way up. And what that does is we've got a great slope in our vineyard. So beyond the great limestone that we have in our soil, that I think you described the benefits of limestone well early on in this webinar, we have a great slope. And the importance of slope is for drainage of air and drainage of water in particular. So water loves to run through limestone quickly, and if you're on a slope, it just runs off the ground quickly. So it forces the roots of our vines to reach down further and further every year, go through all those limestone cracks to be able to find water. And we want to stress those vines in I'll say in a positive way, so they reach down further and further and bring out more character of the soil. And one of the things that I know that's been happening in our vineyard, because it's hard to go down 30 meters or something to see where those roots are, is over time, we've used less and less oak in our wines, and we're going to be talking about our unplugged, our unoaked Chardonnay, because the vineyard and the soil gives the character to the fruit, and we don't have to impact that fruit in any way with winemaking techniques like oak barrels and things like that. So, having a very unique site that is limestone on the bench, less moderated, allows us to develop amazing Chardonnays that we've got here today.
Great. So yes, you mentioned you do obviously some barrel fermented Chardonnays. This is the unplugged version. Just remind me, when you first produced this wine, how many vintages did it take you to understand that even an unoaked Chardonnay could perform brilliantly from your property?
Yeah, the first one was in 2007. It was a warmer vintage. And we thought, this is the opportunity in a warmer vintage to make an unoaked Chardonnay. And what we found is we've done it every vintage since, and even in cooler vintages, it gives us really great concentration, racy acidity, and beautiful texture. So that's when we first did it. And, our goal with Unplugged has always been to, I'll say, reflect the place rather than winemaking intervention. So our winemaker does very little to this. We handpick everything. For our unplugged Chardonnay, it's whole bunch press. We want to get it away from the skins as quickly as possible. And what we do is we have 4 blocks of Chardonnay, and we'll probably pick those blocks 8 or 10 times, depending on the vintage. And what we do is, for our unplugged, we just keep adding one of those picks to that tank. So we'll pick, let's say, 8 picks. So over 8 days, we'll keep adding a different pick. So it could be a different clone, different part of the vineyard. And what we're trying to do there is give a field blend to develop the complexity of the wine. So it's not just, one part of the vineyard, it's multiple parts of the vineyard, multiple soils, multiple picks, adding to the complexity of the wine. And then once it gets into the winery, we obviously are going to add a little bit of yeast for fermentation. It's a long, cold ferment, could be upwards of several months. When we hear a lot about lees stirring or getting the yeast stirred up, we'll bubble nitrogen from the bottom maybe once a week to bubble up the lees, so we get a little bit of the lees character, but it's very, very gentle and delicate. And then we'll bottle it young in the spring, and to preserve that great freshness and fruit flavors that the amazing Chardonnay from the bench produce.
Well, so essentially you're treating this as a premium wine at a not so premium price there. It's a pretty attractive price for the quality on offer here, $17.95. I imagine you get it to market a little earlier so you get some cash flow going, but it must be a little painful to have to put so much effort into it and to sell it for such a steal of a price.
Well, I'll say two comments for me with that. Is the first one is, people ask me what I do. I don't make wine, I don't sell wine. I try and share my passion for wine. So pricing has always been an important decision maker in how we price our wines, because we want to be able to share our wines with more and more people. And I think the other thing that Flat Rock Cellars is renowned for is over delivering on quality, price, and experience of our wines and our place. And I think that's been at the heart of what I've tried to do for the last 15 years. The LCBO has obviously been a big part of it and had some great success there. So that's a big core of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, lovely transparency, lovely vibrancy, and I have to say a little bit more complexity than one might expect from an unoaked Chardonnay at this price point. So mission accomplished on the over delivery. Lastly, just in terms of the customer response you've witnessed over the last 13 years that you've made this wine, are people confused by unplugged? Do they understand what that means right off the top? And are they into oak-free Chardonnay?
They actually get it quite quickly. The whole notion that it's undoctored, pure Chardonnay, I think has gotten through. And I think over the years, it's been super embraced. It's funny, oftentimes it is a favorite of our licensee partners who really love the freshness and of the wine. So it's been quite successful for sure.
Well, on behalf of the Ontario wine trade, thank you for over-delivering and keep it up, Ed.
Thanks, John. Thanks for everything. I appreciate it.
So let's leave the Niagara Peninsula behind and travel to the other side of Toronto to Prince Edward County, the newest viticultural area as of 2007. And let's bring Keith Tyers, the winemaker CLOSSON Chase Vineyards, into the discussion. Hello, Keith. Are you there?
I am, John. Thanks.
Well, terrific. Thanks for joining us. Tell us about your beautiful little part of Ontario. It's an area I know pretty well. I've tried to dig some holes here. I know that there's not a lot of topsoil and a whole lot of rocks, limestone in particular. So tell us how that, plus the very cool nature of this particular climate, really impacts your style of wine.
Of course. So we're located approximately 5 miles in from Lake Ontario to the south. And what we have is we have these beautiful southern-facing slopes with that mealy clay loam over top of the calcareous limestone, which is the ancient seabed of before the last retreation of the glacier, or after the last retreation of the glacier. And what you end up with is a ton of these mollusks and seashells fossilized inside it. So as the groundwater flows over the rock, it erodes that soft limestone because it is quite shaly here. In some places, you can literally crack the rock with your hands. And allows for that minerality to enter the groundwater, which in turn is taken up by the vines, which is then put into our wine and creates our sense of place.
I have to say it's a pretty distinctive style in terms of Ontario Chardonnay. So here you are on CLOSSON Road, which I kind of refer to as the Fifth Avenue of Prince Edward County, a number of wineries along here. So we're dealing not only with this very unique type of limestone, very friable limestone, but also distance from the lake. I find that, a little too close is not a great thing. Too far away, you don't get the moderating effects. And this road and your vineyards, about 5 or 6 kilometers or so from the shores of Lake Ontario, seems to be the right spot to get the length of growing season to create those high tension wines that you do so well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's quite the unique site. We're definitely warmer in the beginning of the season than the guys closer to the lakeshore. And then we also get more temperature variation in towards this time of the year, which I think builds not only the thickness of the skin, but also the acidic contribution and gives us our great sense of minerality, our great sense of place in our Chardonnays. And that southern aspect allows us that beautiful sunlight exposure because everything's south facing. So we get maximum sunlight through the course of the day to help with that physiological ripeness and getting the grapes to full maturity.
Yeah, that's certainly one point of difference in the county versus Niagara, where most vineyards face north. Here, you've got some south-facing sites, and thankfully, because otherwise, I think it would be a real struggle to ripen even Chardonnay. But I'm seeing here with this 2018 CLOSSON Chase Chardonnay we're going to be tasting. I'm tasting now 13.3% alcohol, so really quite ripe and tremendous density. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the yields, and not to get too far into the economics of wine growing here, but this is a premium priced wine that I think over delivers in that premium category. But tell us a little bit about how much fruit you get per acre, for example.
Sure. So for those that aren't aware, we do have to bury our grapevines every fall. So that manual labor has actually started already. As soon as we go through and we thin in at Verazon, the crew goes through and they start to tie down. Just because our time frame is very short, we have to tie down and be ready to hill up by November. And so what that does is it doubles the work in the vineyard, but you're also taking tender fruit and putting rocks and dirt on it. So we also have limited yields, and our yields are already a challenge for ripeness here in Prince Edward County. So my personal belief is that 2 tons an acre is about the standard at which we can get physiologically ripe. And to get all the composition that we need to make great wine. 18 was a super hot year with lots of extraction. This wine was harvested over several days. It's a blend of both sides of the road, both the north and the south, or the church side and the south clos, as we call them. And what you have here is a wine that's fermented in 100% French oak, less than 8% new wood in it, and really looking to define that sense of terroir, that soil, and still maintain the sense of vintage, which is the wines that are grown in that given year. And I think 18 is representative of that. We did get lots of sugar and lots of ripeness in that vintage, but I still believe you still have that sense of acidity and minerality that's in the wine.
And yeah, just putting it in context for me, certainly, first of all, those yields you're talking about are probably about half of what you would get in a decent yielding Niagara vineyard. So we're talking extremely low yields, but I think that also contributes to density. For me, this is not a fruity version of Chardonnay. You know, we could look at the kin from the Niagara Lakeshore area as a much more exuberant, more floral, fruity Chardonnay. This for me is all about texture and non-fruit flavors, that stoniness that we refer to as minerality. I think it exists here without any question, but a nice addition to the range of Chardonnays being produced in Ontario and in Prince Edward County. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for all of your hard work, hilling up vines and struggling to yield fruit, because I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and what I find with this wine is because of that density, you've already gone up from some of the other things that you had mentioned, like the soft cheeses or the hard cheeses, as well as roasted chicken. But here you've got, with that density, you can start to move into like some more firmer meats, like pork, for example. You can move into a pork loin or a pork tenderloin, or get into those really hard, salty cheeses. This wine seems to handle those very well.
Yes, excellent point. Thank you. A little roast tenderloin of pork would be on the menu for tonight. All right, thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you, John. Appreciate everything.
All right, let's now jump back to the Niagara Peninsula. Let's bring in Matt Loney, who's the General Manager for Stoney Ridge Estate Winery. Matt, welcome.
Hey there, welcome. Nice to see you.
Thanks for joining us today. So we've got an interesting story that we're hopefully going to hear from you. First of all, about Stoney Ridge. It's one of the pioneering wineries down in Niagara. Been around for over 30 years now, but also a little bit more recently into making wine for a number of celebrities, like Dougie Gilmore from the Leafs. Who doesn't love Doug? And also, of course, the Canadian iconic band, The Tragically Hip, who are part authors of this Ahead by a Century wine. So just give us a brief little background about Stoney, your particular corner of the Niagara Peninsula, and then a little bit about your collaboration with this iconic rock group.
Yeah, absolutely. Stoney Ridge is, like you said, one of the older wineries. I believe it was the 12th to get its license in Ontario. It was started actually at a different location than when we are now, up on Ridge Road in Stoney Creek, actually, which is where the name Stoney Ridge comes from. And it started out as a garage operation, literally, by the founder, pioneering winemaker Jim Warren. and grew considerably over the years. And then we moved here to sort of middle part of the Niagara Peninsula here in Vineland in 1998. And we're right located at the base of the escarpment. Myself personally, I have extremely kind of a career spanning history of Stoney Ridge. So far I'd bookended it in my career. I started at the winery with a full head of hair when I was in high school back in 1996. So it's kind of funny to me to be back here many years later as general manager, but I do know this winery and its history quite well. And then our winemaker has been in the industry as long as I have. Jeff Innes, he's worked extensively in Niagara, but also up in the county for several years, and also had done some work down in the United States. So with a winery of this age, you do have different owners from time to time, and our owner who bought the winery back in 2013 is Canadian sports broadcaster Bob McCowan, who's quite a flamboyant personality, but definitely enjoys a good glass of wine from time to time, and was excited to have an opportunity to purchase a winery with this much history behind it. And Bob, with his sports world and his broadcasting business, does have a lot of fairly famous connections out in the entertainment and the sports industry, and certainly enough, after a matter of time, the guitarist from the Tragically Hip, who he knows, approached Bob back in 2012 and just said, we're doing it's the 30th anniversary of one of their seminal albums, Fully Completely. So they said, would you mind collaborating? We'll just do a single production of this wine, just something kind of interesting to highlight that anniversary of that album. So, and Bob, I don't believe he was really sold on it, but he said, absolutely, you know what, for sure, we'll work together on a red blend, and we produced Fully Completely. The first vintage was 2012. I think they made about 1,000 cases, and it sold out the weekend of release. So they decided maybe they were onto something here, and perhaps they could continue this partnership along. So we've been making wines for the Tragically Hip ever since. It's a fairly collaborative process, actually. Two of the band members, both the guitarist Rob Baker and Gord Sinclair, have pretty extensive wine cellars themselves and are definitely fans of wines. So I have the sometimes nervous task of vetting them on various blends and hoping that their tastes sync up with mine and the winemakers with what we're looking to produce. And then we've expanded the portfolio a little bit with them, and what we'll be trying later on today is the Head by a Century Chardonnay.
So with this one in particular, did they come to you, the band members, with an idea of a style that they wanted to produce, or how did the collaboration come together?
Yes, the winery had been producing the Fully Completely red blend, which is almost always Cabernet Merlot based for quite a few vintages. And I think it was Gord Sinclair in particular who said, I really like big, robust Chardonnays that have a lot of complexity to them. And can you guys do something like that? And I think his palate style might have been leaning towards warmer climate regions where you have, a real emphasis on body and oak and alcohol, whereas obviously we're distinctly cooler climate. So the challenge has always been to try to, lift up what is a slightly more delicate style of wine coming from the region that we're in and giving it a little more added punch with oak, but without ever taking away that Niagara nuance that works so well with that delicate, vibrant acidity, the sort of classic Niagara tree fruit, the flavors that you get. So it's a bit of a tightrope act, but so far everyone's pretty happy with it.
And is this from estate fruit, or do you source from other slightly warmer parcels of the Niagara Peninsula?
Yeah, we actually work with quite a few different growers, and we span the peninsula. Our four main areas of concentration are the Beamsville Bench, 20 Mile Bench on the western side, but we also do pull a bit of Chardonnay from 4 Mile Creek and also on the west side, Lincoln Lake Shore. So this one's actually 3 different vineyards, 2 on the Lincoln Lake Shore and 1 on the 4 Mile Creek Sub-Appellation for this vintage. And we usually keep that formula fairly consistent year to year, but we do like to try from other regions and other growers. If we find something particularly interesting, we'll bring that in as well.
Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense given the breadth and the depth and the richness of this wine. We're switching registered from the previous wines we've been tasting, which have been a lot more lean and focused. Here we're getting into those riper flavors that you described. So a more generous expression as designed by the Tragically Hip themselves. And I think it's very un-Canadian not to love the hip. I've seen them in concert and, had my own transformative moments with them. So thanks for collaborating with them and bringing them into the wine world. It's a nice little bridge and a great way to introduce consumers to Ontario wine through a Canadian iconic group like that. So terrific, excellent. Thank you, Matt.
No problem at all. It's my pleasure.
And carrying on, all right, let's travel a little bit further up the escarpment to Featherstone Estate Winery and bring in Louise Engel. Louise, how are you?
How are you doing? It's a pleasure to be included.
Thanks so much. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your beautiful little estate. I'm going to throw the map up here just to make it clear where we are. And if I'm not mistaken, Louise, this is a quarry. Is that still active, that quarry that's pretty much right next to your vineyards?
It is very active. Yeah, Featherstone's a fairly small little estate winery. We've got about 23 acres here, right on the 20-mile bench. And our nearest neighbor to the south is Vineland Quarries. And it's a limestone quarry. And you did a great job earlier about describing just how important limestone is in the soils of the area. And we certainly are in a little spot that has really infused itself with limestone and soils that just lend themselves to making great Chardonnays.
So we're doing something a little bit different here. This is the Canadian Oak Chardonnay. Now, there's not a lot of that around. I know Derek Barnett was playing around with a little bit back at Lely, but tell us how you came to embrace Canadian Oak. It certainly is, an interesting part of the story.
Yep. So we've got 23 acres here, and we grow about 3 acres of Chardonnay, and we only make one Chardonnay from that, and it's this one. It's Canadian Oak Chardonnay. We got started making this many years ago, and Derek Barnett certainly was one of the early advocates of Canadian Oak. So this wine is made from grapes that grew on our property. It is fermented with wild yeast that live here, so it's Featherstone yeast. And the wine is fermented and aged in barrels that are made from trees that grew along the Grand River just outside Brantford. So it's local in every sense of the word, absolutely. And it's interesting. So in the fall, when we're harvesting this, we go into the vineyard, we harvest the grapes, the juice is squeezed and put right into barrels, and the barrels are left to ferment. And we usually, having some wild yeast come and start a fermentation on your wine is kind of a winemaker's worst nightmare, because you really don't know where that's going to go or what's going to happen. But we kind of embrace that here. We embrace all those wild yeasts, and so the juice goes right in the barrels go out in the sun. We put a bung in the barrels and we fill the barrels really, really full. And so we know that fermentation has started when the bung is blown from the barrel. And at that stage, we reduce the volume of juice that's in the barrels, bring it down by about 1/3, and put airlocks in them and keep the juice fairly warm. We don't want any fermentations to get stuck. And we do check the juice and the wine fairly regularly as it is fermenting. And we find that by allowing wild ferments to take place, there's really been a number of different yeasts that have acted on that wine to ferment it through the process. So you get a really lovely, really kind of complex and rich wine at the finish. And
yeah, I certainly love the texture that you get out of wild yeast fermented wines, given that there are different creatures at different parts of the fermentation, each contributing in their own range of aromas, but also textural variation as well. So that's a good point to know. I'll wear safety goggles if I'm there in the early stages of fermentation before you've replaced the The airlocks. So I've been touring the Niagara Peninsula. I've tasted a number of the other wines. I roll up to Featherstone and I say, I'd love to try your Chardonnay. I'm a big fan. And you pull out the Canadian oak. So my first question is going to be, well, how does Canadian oak impact differently than French oak or perhaps American oak that's being used? How does it express itself for you in your words?
So I think in classic Canadian fashion, we are a little bit French and a little bit American, and somewhere sort of nicely in between. I think we have that.
A mid-Atlantic oak. That's perfect. That's
absolutely. So I think you get some of the rich, kind of buttery, subtle characteristics that the French oak brings. But there's the grain is fairly tight. I mean, we are a northern climate, so the grain on the oak is not terribly porous. When oak is more porous, then it tends to be a little bit more forward and a little bit more in front of the wine. And this is a nice tight grain because it grows along the Grand River, as I say, in the Brantford area. So there's a nice kind of subtle richness to this and a creamy, buttery character. Not as forward as an American oak might be, but with maybe a little bit more richness and butteriness than you would find in French.
Perfect description. I'm with you 100%. And yeah, that really highlights an important part of the Ontario wine story, and that is the local aspect. I think everyone has gone a lot more local in the last 6 months. And if you can get something right out of your backyard, even delivered to you, that's just a bonus. I think it's what customers are looking for, more and more authenticity in product, and also supporting local businesses, especially when it makes sense, because the wines are also delicious.
Yep, absolutely. And we found too with this Chardonnay, generally we like to introduce about 25% new oak barrels every year into the barrel program, and barrels typically are here for about 5 years. But we find with the Canadian oak Chardonnay, we keep them even to a 6th or 7th year, just to get a really nice kind of rounding and blending of characters. Brand new Canadian oak can be a little bit too forward. And I think when Canadian oak was first brought into the marketplace back around 2000, 2002, it was, and everybody is using 100% new oak barrels at that time because there weren't any that had been used or conditioned. It was a little bit forward, and at that stage we were still playing around with how to best use it. And I think it was criticized a little bit early on because of that. So a lot of wineries got away from it. We stayed with it because we really liked the idea of local and the opportunity to use oak that grew in the area where the grapes grew is a fairly rare opportunity in the wine world. And that's always really appealed to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
We stuck with it. And I'm glad that we did. But as you say, there aren't a lot of wineries that are using it. But I'm hoping that, with the resurgence of the interest in local, that will come back. And kind of a funny story, early days when the folks that were making these barrels were just kind of getting started with it. And this whole project of having Canadian oak barrels on the marketplace was started by a couple of professors from McMaster University. One of them's a brain surgeon and one of them's a marine biologist. And this was kind of their retirement project. And so when they started to cut down some oak trees and play around with cutting the wood into staves, there's no cooperage in Ontario or in Canada that can handle the actual cooperage of the barrels. So the wood is taken into the States, coopered into barrels, and brought back. And those early staves that were carried across the border were taken in hockey bags. And I just think that is the epitome of Canadian history.
Usually people are smuggling grapevines, not
grapes in a hockey bag across the border. How Canadian is that?
That's brilliant. Thanks for amplifying the local story and the Canadian oak. That's great. Certainly for me, the quality of the oak has also improved quite dramatically. And this is lovely wine. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
All right. And let's turn it over now to Harold Teal, the proprietor of Hidden Bench Estate Winery. Harold, do we have you there? There he is. He's joining us. Hello, Harold. How are you?
Excellent. We're not in Beamsville today. We're in the city, but that's always great. You know, it's always great to connect with you guys and listen to
Well,
all.
we wouldn't have known that if you hadn't mentioned anything. Just we'll pretend there's a vineyard out there behind you and your lovely little estate in the Beamsville Bench. So tell us a little bit about your history. You sort of burst onto the scene. We remember it vividly. Your first release, the Nuit Blanche, was our Canadian White Wine of the Year at the National Wine Awards, whenever that was, 2006, 2007. You haven't really looked back since then, kind of waving the flag for premium estate, really top quality wines. So tell us a little bit about your journey and your particular part of the escarpment and what that means for your wines.
Well, my journey basically started with the desire to make terroir-driven wines from the Beamsville Bench and 100% estate. And we basically approached it very methodically, looking at great sites, trying to acquire great sites, replanting them. And, you know, our Chardonnay program has really become sort of one of the cornerstones of our program. We produce Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Riesling primarily. Our 3 vineyard sites, Locust Lane, Felsec, and Rosamel, all have Chardonnay on them, and we have a total of about 30 acres planted to Chardonnay. And all the vineyards are certified organic. And what we're trying to do basically is make wines that express the terroir of the Beamsville Bench. And we're quite excited about, as you alluded to, John, that great Chardonnay is being made throughout Ontario. And we're very excited about our terroir on the Beamsville Bench. And the sites that we have some very old vines, vines that were planted in the 70s. We have vines that were planted in the early 80s. And we have some new sites that are planted to high density Chardonnay with 1 meter by 1.5 meter density. So really a great portfolio of fruit to work with to produce every year consistently good Chardonnay.
You mentioned 3 vineyard sites, but I know they're pretty much right next to each other. There's not a lot of distance between them, so it's, you know, very much that localized estate model. Yes.
Well, it's a localized estate model, but I think, you know, if you look at, I hate to use the comparison to Burgundy because we're not in Burgundy, we're in Ontario, which, you know, you use the Mid-Atlantic phrase. I say we're halfway between Burgundy and California, but certainly. Because of the glacial moraine soils on the bench, there's great variability of soil in a very close distance. When we did the soil pits on the Felsec vineyard, we found 8 distinct types of soil within a 35-acre site. So just because they're close does not mean that the soils will not impute different characteristics to the grapes. And the Rosamel vineyard is.
I fully agree with you, and that for me is the exciting thing. I'm referring to the climate not really changing dramatically. Yes, a little higher, a little lower elevation, but even within a very tight area, as you say, in other parts of the world that start with a V, you know, quite dramatic differences. And it's quite fun to visit you and taste the different vineyards from the Felsec to the Locust to the Rosamel, because there are differences. But but this wine in particular, this is your blend, I suppose, of the 3 sites.
Yes, it is. This vineyard is this wine is basically a blend of all 3 vineyard sites. It's a perennial favorite at the in vintages every year. In fact, it's the top selling Chardonnay in the $25 to $50 brand VQA Chardonnay, and we're very excited about that and the growth of this brand over the years. And clients are sort of embracing it because what they're seeing is that this quality of Chardonnay, they don't need to go to California, they don't need to go to Burgundy. They can get really great organically certified barrel fermented Chardonnay made with indigenous yeast at a relatively good price and superb quality. It's a very dry wine, but it has nice body, nice weight, and great length on the finish as well. And pairs really well with food, and that's one of the things that we're very excited about. Particularly, as you alluded to, John, my connection with Upper Canada cheese. This is a great wine with hard cheeses. It's a great wine during the fall period for Thanksgiving, and we're very excited about this particular vintage because 18 was a little bit of a warmer vintage, but we were able to maintain the freshness and the acidity in the wine, and we're really excited about that as well. And so we're excited about this. Is going to be released on October the 3rd, and we do 2 releases of a Chardonnay a year, and this is we're very excited to have this Chardonnay in vintages.
So is this your Thanksgiving wine? Is this your turkey wine? Or are you going to save this for one of your famous events on the bench sometime around February when you do that wonderful fondue?
Well, we do recollect, and it's interesting. I think this is a great turkey wine, and a lot of people don't associate Chardonnay with turkey, but I love the particularly Ontario Chardonnay. The ability for it to cut through the fatness of turkey is fantastic, and the acidity of Ontario wines as a whole really is a great thing over the Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you there. I mean, I think Ontario produces a number of great styles for Thanksgiving wine. I would drink Ontario Gamay, I would drink Ontario Pinot, certainly Ontario Chardonnay, even Cab Franc, even Riesling for that matter. You know, the
Exactly.
5 main varieties all happen to work particularly well at the Thanksgiving table. And thanks for pointing out the value here. I know for many people, $30 is a pretty premium price to pay for wine. But if you start to look at the international context of the quality on offer here and what you find elsewhere in the world, to mention California, to mention Burgundy, even premium stuff from Australia, you're often paying quite a lot more than this, at least in my experience, for, you know, the full estate treatment, hand harvested, wild ferment barrel, all the rest of it. So well done. Thanks for upping the value factor for us here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. You know, we always look at, you know, the international Chardonnays, and when we started, we want to compare ourselves not only to our contemporaries here in Ontario, but to quality producers across the world. And, you know, for those people who walk into the vintages and want to buy a bottle of La Crema at $29.95, I think the Hidden Bench wine is an excellent alternative that is local, certified organic, and will give them a lot of flavor and length on the finish that you probably don't see in California Chardonnays that often.
Well, I'll withhold my comment on California Chardonnay for now, but thank you so much, Harold. Keep up the excellent work.
Thank you.
All right, and well, that sort of wraps up our little tasting here. I'm going to bring back Magdalena, who's going to wrap up the session with a couple of important facts, some key facts.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, John. I'm sitting here listening to all of these wonderful wines and food pairings and getting super hungry, super excited to get prepared for Thanksgiving. There's so many great messages. First of all, thank you for your time. Thank you to all of the producers for your time today. And I also want to make sure we thank all of the LCBO staff for watching this video and spending time here today. Your commitment, superior commitment to education, knowledge, and service is so critical to our industry, and we're really thankful for your partnership. We just want to make sure that you have a few key facts to take away with you today, including that VQA equals certified 100% Ontario grown. That message is really simple, but so important for consumers to understand. And it really does connect into the local message that is so important, always important, but more important than ever. Ontarians are really looking for ways to support their local industries, their local farmers. And with that, really, Ontario VQA wine is the most sustainable choice for Ontarians when choosing wine. You can see that from the statistics, 18,000 jobs that help us in Ontario. And also each single bottle actually really does give back $98.20 per bottle to our province, which is an amazing number. And then really so much in the last couple of conversations, the value proposition is really undeniable. John has mentioned it, Harold, Ed, a number of the producers have all talked about that. And I think that's really an important message for everybody to take away and share with the Ontario consumer. So if we can just go to the last slide, John, I want to remind everybody at the LCBO that if you have any questions about the wines themselves, the wineries, please do connect with Doug Beattie, who is the Ontario VQA Wine Ambassador. He has seen many of you in person, and in today's world is not able to do so much. So we hope these webinars have been able to inspire some knowledge and ideas for you for food pairings that you can share in the stores in the coming weeks. So thank you again. Have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you.